Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final session of the first day of the Greenlight Guru True Quality Virtual Summit, the 3-day event designed to provide you actionable takeaways you can implement in your own company to innovate faster, stay ahead of regulatory change, and use quality as a strategic asset to grow your device business. This session is on best practices for preparing and conducting pre-submission meetings. My name is Nick Tittman, VP Marketing here at Greenlight Guru, and I will be your moderator for today's event. We've got a really special session scheduled for you today. I know our speaker, Isabella Schmitt, is really looking forward to covering conducting Q-Sub missions with efficiency and effectively. So before we dive too deep into today's presentation and introduce our speaker and her company, Proxima Clinical Research, I'm going to touch on a few housekeeping items real quick. First, this session is going to run for about 45 minutes in total and will include a Q&A session at the end where Isabella has been kind enough to answer all of your questions. So I encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation as they come up in the box on the right-hand side, and we will get to as many of them as time permits. Just for your information, this entire session will be recorded, and you can download the slides at any time right from the window that you are on right now. This is our last session for the day, like I mentioned, so be sure to tune in for day 2 tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time if you're interested in learning how to implement and maintain an audit-ready QMS leveraging technology. I encourage you to make sure that you're registered for the first session tomorrow and use your unique link to tune in. All right. I'd like to first share a couple of words about Greenlight Guru and why we put on this free virtual summit. If you've been to one of our training sessions before, then you know that we put on these because improving the quality of life is our mission here at Greenlight Guru, likely a similar mission as many of you at today's summit. Anything we can do as an organization that helps device makers bring safer, life-changing devices to market quicker with less risk aligns with that mission. We're constantly looking for ways to continue to fulfill that mission, whether it's through hosting free events and training sessions like these, through partnering with world-class medical device consultants like Proxima Research, or through our award-winning medical device QMS software. If you'd like to learn more about why medical device companies from across the globe are moving from paper-based and general-purpose quality management systems and adopting our purpose-built medical device quality management software, I encourage you to head on over to www.greenlight.guru after today's presentation and schedule your free personalized one-on-one demo. All right, now on to the bulk of today's presentation. Let me give you a proper introduction to your presenter today, Isabella Schmitt. Isabella is a RAC certified regulatory affairs consultant at Proxima Clinical Research, a contract research organization that serves the emerging drug and medical device industries. Isabella works with various medical device and drug products from small companies at the earliest stages of development to large publicly traded companies at the latest stages of development as well. She serves as a mentor and judge for multiple accelerators and advises on pitches, value props, and regulatory for well over 100 companies. So without further ado, let me hand it over to your presenter for today. Isabella, take it away.
Thanks, Nick. All right, so today's session is going to be on Q-Subs, primarily focused on pre-subs and a couple of other types of Q-Subs, information meetings and breakthrough device designations, which are the most common types of Q-Subs. So we'll start off with what is a Q-Sub. So most people know of Q-Subs by calling them pre-subs, but Q-Subs can run the gamut from a few different types of engagements with FDA. So they're a way to interact with the FDA. All of them are. You'll get a Q number followed by 6 digits for every Q-Sub, and all subsequent interactions will follow that Q number. So if you're familiar with IDEs or INDs, it's much similar to that. You don't want to have the same topic covered multiple times in any Q-Sub. So that's within reason. If you get feedback from the FDA on, say an animal study, and then you want to have a subsequent discussion about that animal study with the FDA at a later time, you can have another discussion, but you don't want to have, 10 Q-Subs on your animal study. So that's why they want you to do another thing, which is outline the expected submissions if possible. So for expected submissions, you might think of for a 510K, you may have one type of pre-sub. For PMA, you may have 2 or 3, and for de novos, you may have 2 or 3 as well. And that's because with de novos and PMAs, you have a bit more evidence generation that you need to discuss with the FDA, whereas 510Ks in a lot of cases are a bit simpler because you have a predicate that you can sort of mimic. Once you submit a Q-Sub, you can't withdraw the Q-Sub once you get feedback from FDA. So whenever you submit a Q-Sub, you want to be careful to make sure that whatever you're presenting to FDA and once you get feedback from them, that you're putting your best foot forward. You don't want to submit something that's sort of half-baked idea. You want to really go forward with something that you're ready to present to the FDA. So if you're not ready to present it to the FDA, then you shouldn't engage in a Q-Sub. When you get a Q-Sub, your original submission will start with your Q number. And so you'll get that Q number with 6 digits after it. Then every supplement is what they call it, will be the subsequent Q submissions that you submit to that Q number after that. So a Q number will be associated with your device. So if you do a new supplement, which is a new request for feedback or another meeting from FDA, that'll get an S. So you'll have your Q and then 6 numbers, and then it'll have S001 after it. Amendments are another type of thing that you may submit to the FDA. And these are not really requests for feedback, but they're things like meeting minutes or slides that you might send to the FDA, and these will get an A number, an A001, A002 for all subsequent submissions. So there are various types of Q-Subs, as I mentioned, the most common of which being pre-submission meetings, and then you have your informational meetings, study risk determinations, submission issue requests, and breakthrough device designations. So Q-Subs, pre-subs, are by far the most common, as I mentioned. Informational meetings are probably, and breakthrough device designations are probably the second most common types of meetings. The breakthrough device designations obviously being for those devices that would qualify for breakthrough. And informational meetings are higher level meetings than pre-submission meetings. You don't necessarily request specific feedback from FDA. Study risk determinations and submission issue requests are very specific to certain issues, and we'll get into that a little bit later. The general contents of every Q-Sub, regardless of the type, is you'll have a cover letter, and within that cover letter, you'll have your company name, your address, the contact person, and information should FDA need to contact that person. Usually they will to schedule the meeting or send the feedback. You'll have your Q-Sub type, so is it a pre-sub, is it an informational meeting, and then you'll have your meeting and feedback details. So do you want to have a meeting with FDA, or are you just looking for written feedback? If you want to have a meeting, what type of meeting do you want to have? And obviously you need to give them, the purpose of the meeting or the feedback and a description of your device, because if you don't give them a description of your device, how are they going to know what to comment on? And obviously, what your device is going to be used for. Regulatory history, what they're looking for here is if you've engaged with them in any type of Q-Sub before, or if you have, a marketing application in another region. For meeting details, you want to lay out an agenda if you're having a meeting. And so the agenda for the meetings can vary depending on the type of meeting it is. For informational meetings, your presentation might be a bit longer. For pre-subs, it may be a bit shorter because you really want to spend a lot of time discussing the questions that you ask FDA and their feedback. And then you want to also give them the type of feedback that you want from them. So for meetings, you'll suggest 3 times that you may have for the meeting. You'll tell them your planned attendees, and you'll give them your audio visual requirements. So are you going to need a phone line, a WebEx? If you're doing it in person, will you need a projector, internet access? You'll have to request that a few days prior because FDA is they need to give you permission to get access to their internet, and they won't allow you to use USBs on any of their devices or anything. So if you need those types of things, you'll need to let them know a bit earlier. And you want to suggest 3, like I mentioned, 3 days and times, and I'll get to how you suggest those in a minute. It'll be based upon when you submit your package and the number of days after that. So getting into a pre-sub, so pre-subs are a section of Q-subs, and they are the way to obtain feedback from FDA on specific questions for a future intended submission. So if you want to submit a 510K, a PMA, or a de novo in the future, you may have a pre-sub to get information from FDA specifically on your testing plan or your regulatory pathway. If you choose to not have a submission in the future, having a pre-sub, they're not going to force your hand and say you had a pre-sub, you must have a 510K or a PMA in the future. But usually you would submit a pre-sub if you're planning on having some type of marketing application in the future. It's a way for FDA to give you a written response. They will give you a written response with any type of pre-sub. And then if you request a meeting, you can have a meeting with FDA either via teleconference or in person. Usually I don't ever really only request written responses because FDA provides you a written response regardless of whether you have a meeting or not. So you're going to get some sort of written information from them. And if the written information is sufficient, then you can cancel the meeting if you choose not to have it. So there are a few questions that people ask about pre-subs, and the main question, I guess, is why would someone want to have a pre-sub? So pre-subs will improve the quality of your subsequent application because it becomes an interactive review process with FDA. So FDA is more transparent with you with what they want to see, and you're more transparent with FDA about what you're going to show them. And then that transparency allows the review process of your marketing application to be smoother and the timelines to be a bit shorter. Also, pre-subs are free, so other than maybe a consultant's cost, but from FDA standpoint, they're free. So it's a way to get free feedback from the FDA to ultimately have a more successful application in the future. So there are some other questions with Q-subs that a lot of companies will ask me, am I too early? What topics can I discuss? Do I need a pre-sub? Can I just email FDA my questions? Where does the pre-sub occur? So the first question is, do I need a pre-sub? You don't need a pre-sub, they're not required, but they are a really good idea. There are very few cases in which I would suggest not having a pre-sub, that being maybe you're an identical device, so you're not just a Me Too 510K, but you are the same device as another device that's out there. Short of that, it's probably a good idea to have a pre-sub no matter what. In the past, there was maybe a more adversarial relationship between FDA and companies. So some legacy advice that people give sometimes is, oh, well, you have a 510K, I wouldn't worry about doing a pre-sub. Generally, I would not agree with that. It's always good to get some feedback from FDA, even if it's just on how you present your information in a future application. Am I too early? So you're not too early unless you are, which means that you need to be ready to present whatever information you're giving to the FDA. And you need to be ready to defend that. So if you're going to ask them, for example, about your regulatory pathway, which may be one of the earliest types of pre-subs that you can have, you'll need to be able to defend what you suggest your regulatory pathway is. So if you suggest your regulatory pathway is 510K, you'll need to be able to find an adequate predicate and justify why that predicate is adequate. If you're not ready to do that, you shouldn't go to the FDA until you are, because whatever you present to them, if they come back and push back on you, you need to be able to defend that. The topics you can discuss in a pre-sub are variable, and obviously within regulatory reason. You can discuss regulatory pathways with them, animal studies, bench testing, and clinical studies. So things that you may want to discuss with a regulatory pathway are if you don't have a suitable predicate device because you're a novel device, you may want to discuss justification for why you think you're a de novo and you don't need a PMA, or maybe you want a PMA and you want to justify why you should get a PMA. Animal studies, You may want to discuss the appropriateness of your animal model or the sample size of your animal model. Bench testing, you may want to discuss sample size and power analysis. If you're using test methods that are unusual, maybe you're not using standards that are out there, you might want to discuss that with the FDA. And you'll want to justify any testing that you've removed, from a scientific standpoint. So just because there's something that is typically done for testing, that doesn't mean that you always have to follow what past precedent was. You can go forward to FDA and suggest a better route. Clinical studies are obviously something that everybody wants to discuss with FDA because they are your biggest cost driver. And so you really want to discuss, if you're doing clinicals, your endpoints, your size, make sure that you're gathering the right information for that really expensive clinical study. And a lot of folks like to do studies outside of the US, and you want to make sure that whatever data you're gathering from outside of the US is sufficient for a future marketing application, because not all studies are created equal, and not everything outside the US is necessarily applicable to the US. The pre-sub can occur, obviously, as I mentioned, in writing. So you just get written feedback from the FDA. Again, I wouldn't recommend going that route. It's always a good idea to have a meeting. And if you don't want to have the meeting after you get the written feedback, you can always cancel the meeting. You can have a teleconference with FDA, or you can have it in person. There are some benefits both to teleconference and in person. So teleconferences are sometimes scheduled quicker. So that's because the FDA doesn't have to worry about conference room space, and so it's easier for them to get everyone in the meeting. The other thing is teleconferences are a bit less expensive because you don't incur those travel costs. However, teleconferences don't afford you the ability to meet the FDA in person, so there's not that face-to-face interaction, there's not that body language there, and if you want to show them your device, you can't really do that with a teleconference. And there is a strategic thing with the FDA when you go there in person. If you ask them a question that they weren't expecting, if you're in a teleconference, they can put you on hold and have a discussion amongst themselves to figure out how they answered that question. If you're in person, they can't really put you on hold because you're in the room there with them. And so it's, someone's going to answer that question, and maybe the entire group doesn't agree with that, but someone's going to lead it, and that's going to be the feedback that you've gotten. And so sometimes it's strategic in order to have a really open discussion to be in person. The decision that I would make, whether I did a teleconference or in person, was how critical was the discussion that I'm having. So if it's not a really critical discussion, a teleconference is usually sufficient. If it's a really critical discussion, an in-person meeting is probably your best option. And then people ask me if they can just email their questions to FDA. Now, you can email FDA questions, but usually these questions are pretty general. They don't require a lot of research on the FDA side. High-level questions they'll answer. They're very happy to do so. But if you ask them a very specific question about your device, they'll need the context to answer that question. And so they'll tell you that they don't have enough information, and they'll probably suggest that you file a Q-Sub. And again, when you ask questions, even if they get more specific, they will go and ask the rest of their review team before they provide an answer, because again, they want to provide a uniform front. So even if they're willing to answer your question, they usually say, "Oh, I'll get back to you. I need to talk to some other people." And so that gets into the context. The context comes from your briefing packet. So whatever is in your briefing packet needs to be sufficient to answer whatever questions you're going to ask. So you'll obviously need to give them some information about your device, the principles of operation of it, the key components of it, what is your device intended to do, who is the patient population that you're intending to treat or diagnose. And then if you're going to ask them about testing, you'll need to get them information on your non-clinical and clinical testing plans sufficient to be able to answer the questions that you're asking. So questions are what really drives your meeting. And so there are kind of two ways to figure out what you want your questions to be. You may have some pressing questions, and then that drives your meeting packet. But you may also start putting together a meeting packet and then come up with questions that you didn't realize you had. So it's sort of a chicken and egg kind of situation. The packet can drive the questions, and the questions need to drive the packet. So whatever questions you ultimately have, you need to provide enough context for FDA to answer those questions. When you formulate your questions, you want to not leave the questions very general. You want to be specific, and you want to make leading questions for FDA. So like the opposite of what they would tell you in a courtroom, you want to do that with your questions for FDA. So you'll want to maybe reference guidances, standards, regulations to put forth an argument in your question as to why the FDA should agree with you. So some questions here, these are some examples of questions for regulatory strategy. So as you can see in the question, that's sort of that brownish pink color, it says, given that there is not a currently marketed device that can serve as a predicate under 510K pathway, does FDA agree that a de novo request is appropriate? Now, you probably would in your packet have a little bit more context around this because de novo requests have to do with your risk assessment too. But as you can see, the beginning of this sentence is, the beginning of this question is very leading the FDA to agree with what you want them to agree with. And so you want to do that with all of your questions. I'm not going to read every single question on this slide, but you have them as examples. For example, you may ask some software questions. Usually software questions will go along with the level of concern. So when you formulate this question, you may want to say, given that the device will not result in a critical injury or death, does FDA agree that this is a minor level of concern? That might not be exactly what this question says here, but that's the type of question that you want to ask FDA about software. And again, you want to make sure that those questions are leading. Animal studies, you can ask them questions. So things like, suppose you went to the FDA at one point and you proposed an animal study and they came back and told you that they didn't think that study was sufficient for moving towards clinical trials. So then you might go back, revise that study and have a supplement meeting with FDA. Within that supplement meeting, you would ask a question, I've revised animal study, does FDA concur that the revised animal study and the animal plan numbers, whatever it might be, is potential to show that there's, the safety for initiating a clinical trial? And obviously, again, everybody, if you're doing a clinical study, you definitely want to meet with the FDA about that clinical study because it is expensive and time consuming. So you want to make sure that what we typically do in a pre-sub is we'll put forth at least a synopsis. If you have a full protocol, that's always better because then they can comment on your full protocol before you submit an IDE. If you're a significant risk device, if you're a non-significant risk device, you still probably want FDA to vet your protocol. So you may ask some questions about your patient population, your study size, your endpoints, and you can base these off of past precedent or science and medicine. And then again, if you're going OUS, you want to make sure that whatever data you're generating is either applicable to a future marketing application or is sufficient to opening an IDE. Pre-sub timelines, they can vary, but generally speaking, FDA tries to stick within a certain time frame. So the first step is you'll submit your packet to the FDA. Within 15 days, they'll do an acceptance review and reach out to you to schedule meeting dates. So you'll propose 3 meeting dates with them, and they'll come back to you and say that either one of those dates and times works, or they'll suggest another date to you. Within 30 days, you'll have to have the meeting scheduled. 5 days prior to the meeting, they'll send you written feedback, and that written feedback will really guide how you address your meeting, which I'll get into in a minute. And then the meeting is held between 60 and 90 days after you submit that packet to the FDA. Usually what I try to do is get on the lower end of that, particularly with teleconferences, and the meeting is usually granted within the time window that I suggest. With in-person meetings, I try to be a little bit more lenient in the timeline. Again, I usually get the meeting dates that I suggest or within, close to that window. But sometimes if there's not enough availability, the timelines can be extended. After you have the meeting, 15 days post, you are required to submit meeting minutes to the FDA, which they will then review and provide you, their red line version usually, and a final version, and you either accept those or you can say that you disagree. And then 15 days after, whether you agree or disagree, the meeting minutes will be finalized. If you disagree, that'll just be noted. So how to prepare before the meeting. So this is where it gets into a bit more of the strategic items too, with regards to the actual meeting in and of itself. So you want to, again, provide several options for meeting dates. Try to get it as, in as short of review timeline as possible that the FDA will agree with. And then you'll confirm the meeting details with your reviewer. RPM here is Regulatory Project Manager, which is sometimes what people on the FDA side are called. You'll set up a phone line for a teleconference if you're having a teleconference. And, obviously you'll understand the meeting information in person from your regulatory project manager if you're having in-person meeting. And then you'll confirm your attendees and agenda with your reviewer prior to the meeting. Then you'll prepare a presentation. So within that presentation, you'll really want to identify the topics that you want to target. And you need to send that presentation to FDA within 2 days before the meeting. Usually just via email, PDF is fine. So getting into some of the nitty-gritty about the meetings, you have to remember that these meetings are an hour long, unless you request extra time. And so you really want to utilize that hour to its fullest extent. So typically you don't want to go into a lot of detail on your device because you want to assume that the FDA has read and understood your briefing packet. And you can usually tell if they have by the questions that they ask. If it seems like based upon the feedback that you got that they don't, then you may want to spend a little time on the forefront explaining what your device actually is to clarify any misconception that they may have, which can then change the conversation that you have with them. Sometimes if you change the conversation too much, they'll ask you to submit another supplement to hash out some of those details, but they'll try to be as helpful as they can within that hour. But generally speaking, you don't want to go into too much detail in the presentation, quote unquote, format where you're talking about your device and your company, because you really want to allow the time for the discussion. So the discussion that you have with FDA will be based upon the feedback that you got and the questions that you asked. FDA usually responds to your questions and they typically give you additional information that you didn't ask about. And so you'll read through that feedback and you'll prepare your presentation based on that feedback. You don't have to go in the order that the feedback was given to you. So if your first question isn't that important to you, but maybe your fifth question is incredibly important to you, then you can move your fifth question to the first topic of discussion because you want to make sure that you discuss the most important things in this meeting. So you can eliminate questions that you don't need any additional clarification on. In fact, FDA encourages you to do this. Just let them know at the beginning of the meeting that you're not going to be addressing those questions. You also, because you only have 1 hour, you want to be strategic with the people that you invite to this meeting. So you don't want to invite a whole bunch of people, especially people who may be very vocal or opinionated, who want to talk a lot. So be strategic in both assessing the people that you invite to talk to specific topics. Do they have something to contribute to this meeting? Usually you'll want, a clinical medical person there if you're discussing clinical topics. If you're getting into the nitty-gritty of bench testing or design, you'll need your engineers there. You usually want someone from regulatory, and then obviously, executive management will be there to hear what's going on in the meeting as necessary, especially for smaller companies. And then you may want to have someone additional there whose sole purpose is just to take notes, because you will have to provide those meeting minutes to FDA, and you want someone who can get the most out of the meeting as far as being a scribe, so that you can then translate those notes into the format that the FDA requests. At the end of the meeting, you'll summarize all of your action items with FDA. So this typically, I'm going to send you slides. I'm going to send you the meeting minutes within 15 days. Usually they like to see Microsoft Word version of the meeting minutes because that's easier for them to edit. You send that through email. The rest of the meeting minutes, the formal meeting minutes, have to go to the Document Control Center. Still clarify items like that up with the FDA at the end of the meeting. You really want to consider a few things to not frustrate the FDA too. So you don't want to treat them like a consultant. They're here to ask, specific pointed questions that you've provided information to them for. And anything that you hear in a pre-sub meeting is not necessarily saying, hey, you're going to get cleared or approved. It's to help you in achieving that goal in the future. And of course, you don't want to send, last minute questions to the FDA because they spent a lot of time preparing for this pre-sub as it is. Moving on to another type of Q-Sub, we'll go into informational meetings briefly. So informational meetings are really a higher level meeting. You don't really expect feedback from FDA, although you usually get feedback from FDA, but it's less formal feedback. You won't get a written response from them. It'll just be sort of a meeting where they're asking you questions and then you're free to ask them questions. So it's more of a fluid discussion. You may have a bit longer of a presentation in this meeting because you are essentially introducing your company and your device to FDA. That briefing packet will typically contain things like a device description, maybe an overview of the testing that you've done, a brief overview of the testing that you've done thus far, where you think your regulatory pathway lies. And so they'll give you some feedback on things that they may have some considerations that they may have in the future, or, they'll ask you questions about your device and you can interpret that to move forward with, a subsequent pre-sub. The informational meetings are also a catch-all for other types of meetings that may occur with FDA that don't really fall into another Q-Sub. So some examples here are, study design for a non-significant risk study, one that may not be intended for a marketing submission, but you just want FDA's feedback on it. And so they may give you feedback in these instances that would not normally be appropriate for a pre-sub. Study risk determination, I'll go through these pretty quickly. So study risk determination really has to do with whether you're a non-significant risk device or a significant risk device. And non-significant risk device usually are approved by IRBs, whereas significant risk device required to submit an IDE to FDA. And so you can go to FDA to get a study risk determination. If FDA gives you a study risk determination, say that you're a non-significant risk device, they are sort of the final arbiter of that. So the IRBs will have to abide by that with FDA. If they say you're a significant risk device, then the IRBs will have to abide by that. So it's just a way, if you're sort of a borderline case, to get FDA's determination to not hold up the process with IRBs. Because if you go to one IRB and they say you're non-significant risk, but then you have another IRB that says you are significant risk, then you have to inform the IRB that said you're non-significant risk that another IRB said you are significant risk, and then you have to address this within, I think, 5 days with FDA. And so that sort of mitigates the risk, the study risk determination for those borderline cases. Submission issue requests, these are specific to after you've submitted a marketing application, such as, or an IDE, so marketing applications would be 510K, PMA, de novo, and there are some issues, FDA requests additional information, you can have a meeting to quickly resolve those issues with FDA. So for those briefing packets, they're a little bit different. You'll have specific questions and your proposed plans and maybe a protocol to address any of the specific issues that FDA brought up. Breakthrough device designations are one that is very interesting to most companies. I can't tell you how many companies have asked me if they have a breakthrough device. And so things to consider when you're thinking about whether or not you have a breakthrough device, you want to consider their criterion, first of all. So is the condition that you're treating life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating? And that is an important point because FDA is very focused on the indication statement for breakthrough device designations. So you want to make sure that your indication is actually life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating. And then, is the device treating or diagnosing? Sometimes, so there was sort of a hiccup when they put together the language for the law that they left out prevention. And so if you are strongly preventative of some life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating condition happening, you may get held up with sort of a policy flag that the FDA says that you don't qualify because it's more prevention than treating or diagnosing. That's not always the case. With breakthrough device designations, you probably won't find if you're a company, but if you're a consultant, you will find that each division has their own sort of take on breakthrough device designations and what qualifies for a breakthrough device and what's required of a breakthrough device. And so some of them may be held up on this and other ones may not. And then you want to consider, does it provide a more effective option than standard of care? This is another thing that may vary division to division. More effective means different things to some of the divisions. So some of the divisions consider more effective as in, they provide equal accuracy, but remove a sort of adverse issue that occurs with one type of device. Whereas other divisions want it to strictly be like a more accurate device. So when you're thinking about more effective, you want to compare it to the standard of care, and you want to make sure that you have a realistic expectation of technical success, and that can be shown through literature or preliminary data. Preliminary data varies, again, division to division, and device to device. So what they may expect of you as preliminary data isn't clear cut in all cases. So sometimes they request clinical data if they feel that any other type of data is insufficient for showing a reasonable expectation of success. I can tell you that sometimes the policy people and the division people don't agree on what is required for that, but you can get a good feel for what may be required based upon the types of claims you're making, again, with your indication statement being really important. And then you need to consider that, again, the definitions of life-threatening and irreversibly debilitating. Life-threatening means that someone is going to die if this is not treated or diagnosed. Irreversibly debilitating means that you have an impact on day-to-day. And then if you don't treat this, it'll progress to a more severe state that may have an impact on day-to-day. So really consider when you're thinking about, should I apply for a breakthrough device, do you meet these criteria? Then there's, criterion 2, which you have to meet. So criterion 1, we just discussed. Criterion 2, you have to meet one of 4 different options. Usually if you meet more than one of those, you have a stronger chance because maybe FDA doesn't agree with 2A, but they agree with 2C. And so these consist of, do you have a breakthrough technology? So a breakthrough technology is a technology that is incredibly novel or is a novel use of a technology that already exists. And again, you would show this through literature or preliminary data. No cleared or approved alternatives exist. So this means that they must have undergone pre-market review. So if something else is out there in development, maybe they already got a breakthrough device designation before you did, that doesn't preclude you from getting a breakthrough device designation. Cleared or approved alternatives typically will reflect the current standard of care. And again, we're looking at indication specific. So the indication statement is incredibly important for breakthrough device designations. I can't emphasize that enough. Oh, my slides have run over the page. My cup runneth over. So significant advantage. So another one is significant advantages over cleared or approved alternatives. So there are cleared and approved alternatives, but I have advantages over these. And these advantages are usually along the lines of quality of life or safety, meaning I'm reducing hospitalization, I'm reducing some sort of adverse event that occurs with the current standard of care devices, or I'm allowing patients to manage their own care. And then the last one is benefit it is in the best interest of the patients. So this is sometimes confused as a catch-all, and it really isn't. There are specific criterion that fall under this that guides how the FDA views this. So you'll want to know if you're creating a public health benefit. So maybe you have an IVD that can I don't want to use the word prevent, but that can diagnose things earlier to prevent a widespread, contagion or something. So, a great COVID diagnostic. And then, or you might want to have one that it considers that you avoid serious harm that may be with other therapies, or if a patient is precluded from other therapies because of contraindications, but they could have your therapy, that would fall under this best interest of the patients. So here's one example of a breakthrough device designation. This is not one I did because I usually don't like to call up my clients without their permission. But here is, this is one that was publicly announced, and it's a brain implant for patients with blindness. So obviously that is severely debilitating. And so this mimics the perception of light through a miniature video camera worn by the patient that transmits a signal to their visual cortex, which then would allow them to see. So obviously that would meet the breakthrough device criterion. It is novel, and it does treat a life-threatening and irreversibly debilitating condition. And so the way they used this was they were able to engage with FDA early and often, and there was no real standard way to assess the benefits and risks of a device like this. They didn't have past precedent. And so having the breakthrough device designation allowed them to work with FDA to establish those benefits and risks. And that's the end. Where's Nick?
Insightful, very, very detailed. Very actionable, really great stuff. And I think the audience would agree with the amount of questions that we have here. It's always a good sign, lots of engagement. So we'll get rolling here. I know we're slated to go till 5:25 Eastern time. We may go a couple minutes over with this being the last session of the day, and just the amount of responses that we've had so far. So without further ado, we'll kick it off. So Christian asks, does the EU have an equivalent process to FDA Q-Subs and pre-subs?
No. So what's interesting is with the EU MDR being the way that it is currently, a lot of, and that meaning uncertainty in the EU, a lot of companies have been coming to the US to do pre-subs to figure out what may be required for them even in the EU to get, a good, regulatory body like FDA to give them some input into what the FDA would expect for their testing plan. And then they're using that to guide their testing for the EU. For the most part with the EU, I could bite my tongue of this because there's still not much guidance out there yet. But for the most part for the EU, you're probably safe following MDD as much as you can right now. So look at your standards that were there before, because the MDD isn't eliminated. MDR is just adding to the MDD. So figure out what did MDR add to the MDD. And it's usually along the lines of post-market surveillance and clinical requirements, and then move forward from there. And again, I think it's a good idea to engage with the FDA on that front, come up with a really robust plan that you would think the FDA would buy into, engage with them in a pre-sub, and then use that to help guide you in the EU.
Awesome. Great advice. Next one comes from Dan. So you've talked about bench and clinical testing. Any comments you would have on Q-Sub questions on usability validation testing?
So usability validation is a really good topic to talk about in pre-subs, and I hate to always say this, but division to division, it always changes their feedback for everything. Usability, usually you want to consider your use risk analysis when you put forward whatever usability plan you're considering. So the guidance states, flat number of 15 users is what they recommend, but that's not always necessary, and it's not always necessary to have I hate saying this, but it's not always necessary to have multiple, usability testing. You don't always need to do, 3 formative evaluations before summative evaluation. If you have a really complicated device, of course, but that would go into your use risk analysis. So you want to look at your critical tasks, what are the risks associated with those, and come up with a usability plan surrounding that, and go forward with that to the FDA. And I've seen them agree to, less than that 15, but you really want to have a good plan in place that you're really addressing all the potential critical risks associated with use, and that the users are able to effectively use the device.
Alrighty, and then we got a two-part question coming up here, maybe dispel a myth. So Kim asks if we want to consult with a firm about market access and reimbursement pathway for our product, it seems that it makes sense to do so before a pre-submission. Would you agree with that? That's part one. And then two, it sounds like Proxima only works on FDA approval. Is that a true or a false statement?
So question number one, it depends on what the intention of your pre-sub is. I always think it's good to get reimbursement, regulatory, and clinical addressed as early as you possibly can together, to consider them as sort of one sort of decision, because they all affect your market access ultimately, right? But if you're going to a pre-sub and say you're trying to figure out whether you're a 510K or de novo, it may not be necessary for you to have, a market access consultant comment on that, unless of course your reimbursement changes for 510K versus de novo, and you're a borderline case, and then maybe you can change your labeling to get a de novo and get a better, better CPT code or whatever type of, I'm not a reimbursement expert. I know enough to be dangerous, but definitely talk to a reimbursement consultant on that. But you don't need to engage with a reimbursement consultant to have an effective pre-sub. But if you want to talk about clinical, it's probably a good idea. You can also engage payer. You can request that payers engage in a pre-sub with you. And that's a good idea depending on how worried you are about what your clinical requirements may be for payers. So if you think for regulatory approval, you need 100 patients, but payers are going to say you need 5,000, then maybe you don't want to bring them into that meeting. So consider what you think for regulatory approval is going to look like first, and then maybe ask a reimbursement consultant what they think it would look like for payers before you engage them in, before you bring payers into the actual meeting. But more for clinical, I think that engaging with reimbursement consultants early on is particularly good. The second question, no, we don't just do FDA. We do a lot of FDA, but we do EU submissions, so CE marks as well. And some Canadian submissions, but Canadian submissions are, not to hate on Canada, but Canadian submissions are pretty rare just because the market is small. And so people usually want to go to the EU or the US first because of the market size, and then Australian submissions, they can usually get approval if you have EU approval. So we don't do any Asian submissions or anything like that.
Gotcha. Thank you for dispelling that myth. We got a comment here. I just think this is good. So this is from George Zach, who's one of our speakers with Two Harbors Consulting. It's going to be speaking with us here in the coming days on the virtual summit. But he said, not a question, but not inviting opinionated people who talk a lot is some of the best and most humorous feedback I've ever heard. That is great. Just want to put that out.
That was good. Yeah.
That's for expert advice. Going on here, we got a couple questions around this topic of recording meetings with FDA. Is it permitted? Is it common? Are you allowed to record those?
Nope. You are not allowed to record them. That's all I'm going to say.
You can go down a rabbit hole on that one. Well, we'll try to get to one or two more here. Next one, is product classification separate from the pre-sub meeting? If not, how do I include questions that depend on product classification in one meeting?
So there are two ways that you can kind of figure out what your product classification is. You can do a 513G, which is different from a pre-sub, or you can talk about it in a pre-sub. 513G I usually don't recommend those because it's essentially, this is what your product classification is, and then that's all they tell you. Whereas with a pre-sub, you can ask them product classification questions and then get information on testing as well. So with product classification questions, you would essentially put forth, here's my risk assessment say. So I think, and here's a product code that I found, and here are other devices that are similar under that product code, one or two of these things, or I don't have a product code. So I think I might be a de novo because my risk isn't high enough to justify a PMA, say. And you would put that in your packet, and then you would ask FDA, based upon XYZ, you'd kind of do a short summary of what you've established in your packet and your question. Does FDA agree with, this product code and, being class 2 and filing a 510K or de novo? And they'll usually respond to that and they'll give you an answer. Now, you want to remember that classifications are never final until your final market application. So they'll give you feedback in a pre-sub, but they can change their mind. Now they usually don't. They try to stay consistent with their feedback, but they can change their mind if there's some sort of public health thing that comes up after the fact, or some new scientific evidence that they learn about after the fact, or you get a change in your review team. I have seen it where a change in the review team moved a company from a 510K to a de novo, but that is not the common case. I would say they usually are consistent with what they tell you.
All righty, thank you. And one final question here to wrap up the first day of the True Quality Virtual Summit comes from Robin. If your device has received designation as a breakthrough device, do you recommend a Q-Sub meeting with FDA to determine the appropriate submission approach? Or would you just submit the 510K addressing any feedback from FDA that arose during breakthrough designation review?
So the feedback for the breakthrough designation typically is just specific to the breakthrough. So if you get feedback, it may not have anything to do with your testing. Sometimes it will, because they'll say your testing right now isn't sufficient to establish a reasonable expectation of success. But a reasonable expectation of success is not the same thing as the valid scientific evidence needed to establish safety and effectiveness. It's just your preliminary stage of that. So you should engage with FDA after you get a breakthrough device designation in a pre-sub or one of the other formats that are allowable with breakthrough device designations. So you can do pre-subs, but they're also, they'll discuss things through sprint discussions with you, which are, interactive and iterative discussions on a very specific topic. So suppose you have a very specific question about your clinical study, you'll go back and forth with FDA on that specific question. That's something that you get with breakthrough device designations that you don't with a standard type of device. And there's other things where they'll talk about your entire data plan with you with breakthrough device designations. So, but again, you can do, your standard pre-sub as well, which people do. I have clients who still do the standard pre-subs. When you have a breakthrough device designation, they try to get your pre-sub reviewed a bit quicker. And obviously senior management is involved in all of those discussions with breakthrough devices, but they won't guarantee it. As usual, they don't really guarantee anything, but they try. I will say they try. And some divisions, again, are better than others.
All righty. Well, we are at the end of our day one for the True Quality Virtual Summit. Just an amazing presentation, Isabella. Thank you so much. There's so many great comments coming in. Just great presentation, lots of practical advice. Really enjoyed it. Another excellent presentation. Well worth the late day here in Europe. So it sounds like we got people staying up late.
Really late day in Europe.
Right? So.
Yeah, so if anybody has any questions that I didn't get to answer or you didn't ask because you were shy, you can send me an email or connect with me on LinkedIn and send me a message and just let me know that you saw this and ask me whatever questions you want.
Awesome, thank you.
Well, not whatever you want, within reason.
Within reason. Yeah, there's plenty of questions left here, and obviously we'll be sending those to you as well. Where can people find out more about Proxima?
So our website is www.proximacro.com, and we also have a LinkedIn page, and we usually try to be pretty active posting on LinkedIn. So if you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll find out information about us too.
Awesome, and they got great stuff on there. They are a great partner of ours here at Greenlight Guru. Be sure to go check them out. Alrighty, this is end of day one. We look forward to seeing you all tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern time for day 2 of Greenlight Guru Quality Virtual Summit. Thank you all for attending today, and thank you once again, Isabella, for your time and presentation. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, take care, everyone.